Good evening, everybody. Sakis, what do you think? 6:09. U of T usually starts at 10 after. We're going different tonight. 6:09 is our start time. I'm going to be very brief, but I've also want to just acknowledge that my dear friend, Professor Phil Trivatopoulos, wrote me my remarks because he knows that I'm always prone to go way off script. So it was kind of him to give me a script, Sakis and Kostis, this is great. So welcome to the 2024 Hellenic Studies Annual Lecture. And Phil, if I'm correct, last year it was 2023, obviously, and we had a lecture on the 100th anniversary of Lausanne, correct? And this year we're 50th anniversary since the end of the dictatorship in Greece. And you'll hear more about our guests from my colleague Sakis Gekis. It comes to me to kind of thank the sponsors because an event like this requires a huge amount of input from students, from faculty, from staff, but I want to thank particularly the Hellenic Heritage Foundation. And I could say a lot about the HHF. I've been working with them for more than a decade now. And in this, we're online, right? We're online. George knows this. It's my favorite group of donors to work with, all right? It's been, since we started, how long has it been? It's been more than 10 years now that we launched this program, and we've had always such a nice time together, and I'm always happy to be involved. The Hellenic Studies program here has Greek language teaching, it has Greek politics, it has a summer course in Athens, and it has a field trip to Greece. The common thread in all those courses and activities is that, and this is always worth mentioning, they're all taught by one single person. And that is, and it's always important for me to acknowledge him, and he's sitting back there and he's smiling at me, because he's a dear friend, Themistoklis Aravositas, who, without him, I think the Hellenic Studies program at U of T would be very much diminished. But having said that, I'd like to give him a round of applause, because it's a pleasure for me. He makes running a program like this extremely easy and also fun at the same time. And through this, I engage more with Phil, of course, and I engage with Sakis at York. So we've developed a nice, really nice and a fruitful collaboration over the past decade or so. So having said that, HHF is our lead sponsor here, and we also want to thank the Hellenic Canadian Academic Association of Ontario, HCAAO, the Hellenic Studies Initiative, which is different from the Hellenic Studies program, but I'm not going to explain what the difference is to you because it doesn't really matter, and the Chair of Modern Greek Studies at York University, of course, and my own center, which is Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. But if you get your email today, did any of you get an email today? Sorry, I'm already off script, Phil. I'm way off script. We are now the Center for European and Eurasian Studies. After a long and serious process, we have taken the name Russian out of that, and that's official. So if you didn't get an email, stay tuned. We're going to be changing some websites and things like that. For the time being, we're Ceres. And I want to thank particularly Tanya Mehta, who's our program officer at Ceres, and she's the one who helped put all this together. And after the talk, we'll also get our usual official caterer of the Hellenic Studies program and the Hellenic Studies Initiative, and maybe the chair of Modern Greek History. We do have an official caterer, and that is, of course, you guys know who it is. It's catering by Nikos, and he'll be there after the lecture. So that said, that's my introduction. I'm going to hand over to Professor Gekis, the chair at York University, the Hellenic Heritage Foundation Chair of Modern Greek History at York University, and he's going to introduce our honored guests. Thank you so much for coming, and I look forward to the lecture. Kostas, welcome to Toronto.
Thank you very much, Rob. It's wonderful to introduce a very good friend and colleague, Kostis. I want to thank, first of all, the Monk School for the hospitality and the center, and my good colleague, Phil and Rob. I'll be very brief because we're really looking forward to this talk. I will say briefly that Kostis Kornetis is Assistant Professor of Contemporary History at the Autonomous University of Madrid. He has taught at Brown, New York University, and the University of Sheffield, and was Connex Marie Curie Experienced Fellow at Carlos III Madrid, and Santander Fellow in Iberian Studies at St. Antony's College, Oxford. He's the author of Children of the Dictatorship, Student Resistance, Cultural Politics, and the Long 1960s in Greece by Bergan in 2013, and co-editor of Consumption and Gender in Southern Europe since the Long 1960s by Bloomsbury in 2016. Also author of Rethinking Democratization in Spain, Greece, and Portugal by Palgrave Macmillan in 2019, and the 1969 Greek Case at the Council of Europe, A Game Changer for Human Rights by Bloomsbury, forthcoming. His next monograph, A Collective Biography of Southern European Democratization The Age of Transitions is forthcoming with Oxford University Press. As you probably gathered, Kostis Kornetis is extremely well-traveled, is definitely the most international Greek historian of our generation, and it is definitely, and some people say, you know, you have to write at least one important book in your career. Kostis is definitely going to do that, and I'm delighted to say that he has already done that with Children of the Dictatorship, which when he wrote it, really, there was very little about that extremely important period of Greek history, but also in the way in which Kostis approached it, and we learned so much about it. So I'm delighted to introduce him. I want to thank you for coming to Toronto for the second time, and I'm sure it's not going to be the last one. Kostis, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here, and it's true, it's the second time. Last time was 10 years ago when I presented my last monograph, which was Children of the Dictatorship, in a very different setting, right? Where was it? Saki, Ontario? Exactly, yeah. But I have a very fond memory of that time, and it's always a great pleasure to be here. And thank you so much to the Hellenic Heritage Foundation and to my very good friend Sakis Gekas for the invitation. So, battles over how we remember the past are not just battles over the past. They also structure the political space of the present. We live in a moment in Europe characterized by a crisis of memory regimes, whether this concerns World War II, the period of communism, or in the case of Greece and Southern Europe, the dictatorial past and the transition to democracy. Post-authoritarian societies face enormous complexities, especially with the second or third generations coming of age and demanding often a different social and political contract than the one achieved after 1945, 1989, or in our case, the mid-1970s, and Greece's democratization after the fall of the colonel's junta. It is precisely such complex matters that form the core of my current book, manuscript, that Sakis mentioned, as well as today's presentation. So, let's start with this picture, where in July 2017, Alexis Tsipras, leader of the radical left-wing party Syriza, was at the time the Prime Minister of Greece. And here we can see him giving a speech on the anniversary of the country's passage from the military dictatorship to democracy on the 24th of July 1974, the so-called Metapolitevsi. Now, I quote from Tsipras' talk, quote, "What we need is a new Metapolitevsi that will lead to a new Greece." Now, just to make a comparative comment here, a few years earlier, in 2015, this guy, Pablo Iglesias, then leader of the radical left-wing party Podemos in Spain, had published a book called A New Transition. So what we can observe here is a regenerationist discourse that evokes a pivotal moment of rupture, the transitions, used here for political objectives. The redeeming power of the Metapolitevsi, or the Transición in Spain, animated the political, cultural, and public discourse of these relatively young political leaders, actually both already out of power, who although, or precisely because they had not experienced these events directly, kept returning to them. Now, today I would like to talk to you about two things. The question I would like to discuss is, what role did the Metapolitevsi play in Greek society, culture, and politics ever since 1974? And how does Greece, as a post-authoritarian society, remember this past, again, this period called Metapolitevsi, and why does this matter? To do so, I will first look at some facts. I will consider the initial period of the transition and its accomplishments, maybe some of its setbacks. Look at the term we use to understand the transition, its periodization. And finally, I will briefly discuss the debates around the period, especially during the time of the economic crisis, when somehow this time of the 1970s, let's say, became a moment, a point of scrutiny. Now let's look at some facts. From 1967 to 74, as we know, Greece was ruled by a repressive military junta of army colonels, a fiercely anti-communist and chauvinist regime that systematically censored and tortured its opponents. This is, of course, the phoenix with a bayonet, right? The symbol of the regime. There was silence, I would say, in terms of the society. The society was somehow frozen by this. This silence was broken only in very few moments. Interestingly, it happened in a couple of funerals of public figures that somehow gave people the opportunity to voice their anger. One was of liberal politician George Papandreou in '68, and the other one was the funeral of George Seferis, the Nobel laureate poet, in 1971. As we all know, the major act of popular resistance in years, again, otherwise characterized by generalized silence, and at times also passive compliance on behalf of parts of Greek society, had to do with the student movement. One were the law school occupations in February and March 1973, but especially the Polytechnic uprising in November 1973, which was violently crushed by the regime. And of course, this is the most famous soundbite of the occupation, the slogan, bread, education, freedom. Now, it was this uprising that provided the very grammar and repertoire of protest for the entire post-dictatorship era. Again, this is, I think, the most important catchphrase in this story. Now, despite this pressure coming from below, the junta's fatal moment came in the summer of 1974 when it orchestrated a coup against President Makarios of Cyprus to facilitate the unification of the island with Greece. It was the Turkish invasion of the island that convinced the Greek dictators to transfer power to the civilian politicians in order to clean up the mess. A government of national unity was formed in July 1974 under the conservative politician Konstantinos Karamanlis. Here we can see him being sworn in, I mean, this famous moment by the Archbishop of Athens, but at the same time under the seeming surveillance of General Gizikis, the president of the junta at the time. Therefore, the transition to democracy in Greece was actually elite-driven, engineered, and implemented, we might say, from above. Karamanlis went on to build a government of national unity. He legalized the Communist Party immediately in September 1974. He called elections, which he won by a landslide on November 17. He called a referendum, which abolished monarchy in December. And shortly after, in 1975, the constitution was voted. In February 75, an attempt on a coup d'etat on behalf of junta nostalgics in the army was neutralized. Now, in a few words, the great issues of the post-Civil War period, meaning the ban of the left, the anomaly of the crown's intervention in political affairs, and the army's Praetorianism, were dealt with. So these were game-changing decisions. But how does this transition that I refer to very rapidly solidify into collective memory and become part of, let's call it, an ordered biography of a nation, to use a recent contested term? Yannis Voulgaris then leader of the Euro-Communist student organization Rigas Fereos and prominent political scientist at present, remembers the feeling of liberation that the swift legalization of the Communist Party, remind you, out of law since 1947, signified for him. And I quote from an interview with him. And suddenly, the Communist Party, the KKE, became legal, and the newspapers of the left started to circulate again. They had been censored since 1952. As I was born, raised rather, into a left-wing family in post-Civil War Greece, these were some established experiences which gradually faded away, day by day, week by week. End of quote. The 1970s brought tremendous change to the entire Southern Europe. The almost simultaneous demise of the Estado Novo in Portugal and the Francoist regime in Spain. This is one of the most famous depictions of the Spanish transition, and this is an actual photograph of the Portuguese Revolution, rendered them, we might say, equal parts of the Southern European canon for the third wave of democratization, according to Samuel Huntington's term. And here you can see some dates according to Huntington's third wave of democratization, or Nikos Poulantzas, the Greek sociologist in Paris, who talked about the crisis of the dictatorships. Now, but of course, that's the story from above. In terms of grassroots action, post-authoritarian social movements were driven by a young generation isolated during the dictatorship. Sloganeering, shouting in the streets, demonstrations broke the silence of the junta years. We might say that this is a passage of this young generation from silence to voice and noise, and from colorlessness to color, or rather from a perspective of grayness during the junta years to a predominance of redness, as they were reconquering the hitherto deprived public sphere. And these are some snapshots from Nikos Koundouros' signature documentary, Songs of Fire, which captures precisely this feeling of joy from the sudden gift of democracy, all the redness that you can see here dominating the public sphere. This was a kind of banned color until that time, but also the anger over Cyprus and demands for transitional justice, the slogan being, "Δώστε τη Χούντα στο λαό." So that time has been generally recorded in memory and affect as days of great exaltation. Present-day writer Apostolos Doxiadis vividly remembers the day the junta fell, citing an incident of crowd violence in Athens against the hitherto all-powerful ESA men, ESA being the military police, now reduced to scared beings surrounded by an angry crowd in his narrative. I quote, "It was that mood of crazy joy, and we were drunk with that feeling. We couldn't believe it. The junta fell suddenly. A miracle had happened. You know, it's like seeing a paraplegic stand up and walk. You cry and you're touched. And then he tells you that he now needs to get shoes, you know, practical things. I came home drunk with joy, a joy that was Dionysian, sheer bliss. But some ESA men passed by, and they were surrounded by a crowd, not a violent one, bourgeois people from Kolonaki. And they started to shake their jeep and shout, ESA SS vasanistes, ESA SS torturers, for whom, of course, I was not sorry, regardless of whether they had tortured people or not. But they were pale. And we said, come on, guys, just leave them be. That play is finished now." End of quote. Now, this story reminded me of this photograph taken a few months before in Lisbon. And we can see a member of the former secret police, Pave, who was almost lynched by crowds of enraged people. And, you know, he's being saved in the very last minute by some soldiers. So, but compared to the rest of Southern Europe, and I would say also much of Latin America later on, Greece was the only country where the ringleaders of the coup were tried and given life sentences shortly after the collapse of the dictatorship in the summer of 1975. Still, and we can see them here, still the majority of junior officers and the most notorious torturers, probably people like the ones Doxiadis mentioned, received surprisingly light sentences. There were no purges in the public sector either, like in revolutionary Portugal or many years later in post-communist Poland. There were no trials or purges whatsoever, however, in Spain, where institutionalized amnesia followed the blanket amnesty of 1977. And many important political scientists nowadays, in fact, place a lot of emphasis on the role of transitional justice in deepening democratic practice in post-authoritarian societies. Be it as it may, this initial transitional past was pregnant with a wide horizon of possibility, which is greatly captured in this painting by Greek-Portuguese painter Nikias Kapinakis, merging the Greek and Portuguese transitions with Marianne and the French revolutionary tradition. It is fittingly called Delacroix on the 25th of April, the day of the Portuguese Revolution, in Athens. And you can see there the Greek flag on the left-hand corner on the top. Now, these first post-junta months signified, and again, I think that this painting in a way captures this slice of life at the time. They signified a capture of speech. There was a potential in communicative production that was indeed liberating, also in terms of gender and sexuality. Several feminist organizations and Greece's first gay rights movement, AKOE, were founded during the mid-1970s. Is this an ex-post reading trying to look at the Metapolitevsi as an inclusive, all-encompassing, and empowering moment? There is a rift in opinions about this. An important modern Greek scholar, Dimitris Diovas, believes that this is the time of inclusiveness, and that Metapolitevsi is all about new identities. Then again, historian Adonis Liakos believes the exact opposite, that Metapolitevsi was very slow in including new identities in its agenda. Anyway, we can come back to this in the discussion. But how was all this rupture commemorated, represented, and ultimately remembered in the following years? As scholars Anastasakis and Lagos put in a recent volume on the Greek junta, the July 1974 moment of the breakdown of authoritarian rule retained a dual conflicting significance in the subsequent intergenerational memory as a moment of national tragedy on the one hand, and a moment of celebration for the victory of democracy over the dictatorship on the other. This is, of course, Karamanlis again. The fall of the colonel's regime and Karamanlis swearing in as prime minister has been formally celebrated with a gala organized by the President of the Republic and attended by all political leaders as elected prominent personalities ever since. However, it has always been a rather awkward celebration, overshadowed by the Cypriot tragedy. This is a poster of Michalis Kakogiannis' celebrated documentary, Attila 74. November 17, by contrast, day of the Polytechnic, was a competitive date of commemoration ever since the transition. The first Polytechnic commemoration, we can see it here, 1974, was in fact a rite of passage that signified the construction of a people as a new political community emerging out of a collapsed regime. The Polytechnic turn to the major legitimizing incident of the democratic transition, as evidenced by the fact that the first post-junta elections were scheduled for November 17, 1974. Before long, November 17 was established as a day of national celebration. So this specific date was appropriated and transformed into a national symbol. Historian Antonis Liakos, again, is adamant that the Polytechnic is the Metapolitevsi's real celebration, as it encapsulates the ideotype of a heroic anniversary through rebellion, sacrifice, but also of a religious ritual of sorts, through repetition. I quote, this is Liakos. The Polytechnic as a memorial site stood behind the Metapolitevsi like its shadow. The transition was accountable to the Polytechnic. Had it or had it not fulfilled its requests? Was the sacrifice justified or not? The Polytechnic was the Metapolitevsi's superego. And of course it had its martyrs and so on. I think, you know, the whole idea of the religious ritual, I think is an interesting one. Now, both the the July 24 transition, and this is from the annual gala, this is from the mid-1990s with President Kostis Stefanopoulos there, and the Polytechnic celebrations, again, they remained two moments symbolizing the discrediting and the downfall of the junta, respectively, and they continue to be commemorated in a unique way, again, often stirring controversy until the present day. Radicalization is another important moment when we think about the initial times of the Metapolitevsi. Radicalization fed abundant violence on the ground, both in terms of far-left political violence, far-right violence, and police repression, as we can see here. Much of the radicalism and anger of a younger generation was directed against what they saw as the dark underbelly of Greek society, the silent majority that had condoned authoritarianism for years. Yannis Kaladzi's graphic novel Gypsy Orchestra from 1980 conveys much of this radicalism. The protagonist, we can see him here, is a young journalist experimenting with new lifestyles whereby the personal became political, but also with leftist intransigence, which at times resulted in the embrace of political violence in post-junta Athens, which is depicted in the graphic novel as a space filled with brutal policemen. So the whole idea of continuities is already there. This radicalization would also mark the beginning of endless bickering and feuding factions within the left. Present-day novelist Petros Tatsopoulos recounts, I quote, "I remember countless hours of politics. I remember the myriad heresies of the left. I do not remember right-wingers. These were the village fools. Obviously, there was the right-wing student union, DAP, and all that, but I don't remember them. All I remember is the left and the left." End of quote. Now, this tense but exciting transitional period in Greece, the Metapolitevsi, or the early Metapolitevsi, stretched throughout the 70s and on to the 1980s, with PASOK's victory in 1981 and beyond. Now, let us pause for a second, so I can drink some water, and consider the term we're using, Metapolitevsi. Now, paradoxically, this instantaneous regime change that Metapolitevsi denotes, I remind you that the word, strictly speaking, means the instantaneous succession of a political regime by another one. This word ended up characterizing a much ampler period, which in a way it is an oxymoron, it is a contradiction in terms. I suggest that we should think of the term as a chronotope, as coined by Mikhail Bakhtin, at once an era, a historical period, an ongoing process, a path defined by the expectations of a wide variety of subjects, an intersection of axes and fusion of indicators, as Bakhtin notes. If the metapolitevsi is then a chronotope, which partly explains the term's durability and semantic intensity, maybe confusion, the questions related to its temporal denominations, in other words, its periodization, are crucial. We saw its founding moment, but what were its internal axes and intersections, as Bakhtin questions here, and how can we judge whether its perennially alleged end has finally come? Did it end in late 1974 with the first free elections and the abolition of monarchy? In 75 with the Constitution? If not, why not? In 1977 with the second elections? But none of the above has generated a consensus over its end. 1981 with the first center-left government of PASOK in power in the country's history seemed to do so for a while, with the ultimate consolidation of the new democracy, with the change in power of the two main parties and the socialist triumph, being considered and being a very important rupture. But again, there was not a consensus about that, even though PASOK is often seen as a metonymy of the metapolitevsi. PASOK brought about changes in the 1980s, which included a major educational reform, the form of family law, the creation of the public health system SC, and many others. Much of these followed suit some Nea Demokratia reforms from the late 70s, which were, however, not wide-reaching nor bold enough. But PASOK also introduced the public recognition of the Greek resistance during the 1940s, the national resistance, during the Axis occupation. This is a real turning point in Greek society at the time. The symbolic weight of this decision was enormous, greatly affecting the lives of the hitherto excluded and persecuted left-wingers. Now, a further dimension, and this is something we can talk about, this time from 1974 to 1981, which is very often quoted in interviews as a time where fear and some among left-wingers in a way lingered on despite the transition. A further dimension of the 1980s was, of course, Europeanization. A loaded term, this cultural process coincided with the country's accession to the European Economic Community, the EEC, upon Karamanlis' initiative and insistence. Greece joined in 1981, of course, and Papadreou, despite his slogan, never really challenged Greece's European track, while Portugal and Spain also followed suit in 1986. Interestingly, all three countries were under socialist governance. Now, the socialist parties, and their capacity to adapt to political change, abandoning their minoritarian position in the 1970s, only to gain large majorities, overcome the communist parties, and form a series of governments in a relatively short time, is something that we see in common between these three figures. You can see Felipe González on the top left, Spanish leader, and again, Andreas with a roll neck there. And the bottom is Mário Soares, the Portuguese socialist leader. All three of them very charismatic. And the fact that the socialist parties which they led became the dominant parties during the 1980s, abandoning their Euroscepticism and leading their country's European integration, constitutes some similarities that cannot be ignored. The post-dictatorial European South yearned for liberty and democracy, and the EEC stood to guarantee it, or at least that was the feeling at the time. Indeed, the idea of joining Europe, as it was called, has often been connected ex post with the three countries' democratization. The process was occasionally equated semantically with turning European, which meant becoming modern, sophisticated, and wealthy. Now, of course, these are all cliches, and we can talk about this. But already in 1985, Greece had to make structural economic adjustments within the EEC. So already then there is a moment of truth with Kostas Simitis as a Minister of Finance, opening the path to what later on became, well, Greece's accession to Maastricht in the early 1990s, and the introduction of that terrible word, litotita, or austerity. This can be considered a transitional coda, a moment during democratic consolidation which at the same time critically reshuffles the initial socioeconomic and political transitional arrangements, in the words of sociologist Robert Fishman in his signature work, Democratic Practice. Several historians, as of late, however, tend to argue instead that the transitional coda should be placed in 1989. Not only because of the brief end of PASOK's hegemony under Andreas, but especially because of the government of coalition between left and right that ousted him from power, supposedly to reconcile the country. To mark the idea of the coda, the entire Greek political spectrum decided to incinerate in industrial furnaces some 17 million files of left-wingers formerly suspected by the police as a symbolic act of reconciliation. Well, other than symbolic, this was, of course, especially for historians, a state-sponsored, we might say, act of vandalism. Interestingly enough, however, even this reconciliation through fire did not bring the end of the Metapolitevsi. The arrival of the new millennium was characterized by constant evocation of its imminent end. The arrest in 2002 of the members of left-wing terrorist group 17th of November, that was born right after the fall of the regime in 1974, was a telling example. Journalists, academics, and politicians refer to it as the definitive end of the Metapolitevsi and the disappearance of the last remnants of the ideology and practices of the 1970s, the indirect offspring of the junta years, and the civil war trauma. Some commentators used the 2008 riots as a moment of rupture that could be read as the end of an era, again, the end of the Metapolitevsi. Even more spectacularly, however, the end of the Metapolitevsi, or its coda, was projected by analysts on the 2009-10 economic crisis. Until then, a hegemonic version of the events of the 1970s ruled the day. The established official narrative, used both by academics and politicians, and embraced by those who lived through and shaped the Metapolitevsi, had thus far emphasized the positive impact of institutional legacies of democratizations, reading the transition both as accomplished and as an accomplishment. The Greek transition became the textbook case of a model transition. Again, Yannis Voulgaris described it in 2002 as a velvet transition and a political masterpiece. What followed democratization was redistributive policies, welfare state building, expansion of the middle classes, rising living standards, European integration. And there may be moments or historical periods when a consensus is pervasive in a society, when a single script over the past is widely accepted or even hegemonic, in the words of memory specialist Elizabeth Jelin. And until 2009 and 10, there seemed to be a consensus about this celebratory and widely accepted reading on the Metapolitevsi. But then, with the crisis, this reached an expiration, or seemed to be reaching an expiration date. Trying to make sense of the crisis forced a revisiting of the period of transition and generated some deep soul-searching through a re-examination of Greece's relation, of the transition's relation to the present. Novel rereadings, more critical representation of the transitional past, started to question the consensus of the single script. As the debt crisis hit Greece exceptionally hard since 2009, again, this is called the Great Recession, I think we have the beginning of a tense public debate over the role and meaning of the Metapolitevsi. And I would say that we have different interpretations, ranging from the overtly damnatory to the nostalgic. So on the one hand, the idea was metapolitefsi created the welfare state. On the other, it was the welfare state that overburdened Greece with deficits and debt. While the metapolitefsi did bring new parties to power, these parties became cartels that fed on corruption and frivolously spent on patronage. Similarly, EU membership was considered a gift that ended up being seen as a curse. And finally, even the Polytechnic revolt might have been the foundation of which the Third Greek Republic was laid on, again, this grassroots resistance against the colonels, but its legacy, some analysts argued, was linked to an ingrained defiance of authority that supposedly encouraged a culture of anomie and fomented resistance to reforms, dubbed the culture of metapolitefsi. Now, the catalyst for the demonization of this period of metapolitefsi, again, was the economic and political crisis. And I would say that PASOK in particular became a typical way of looking at the metapolitefsi, not anymore as an achievement, but as a continuous setback. PASOK now, in the words of, especially in some media outlets, was presented as standing for everything that went bad in the metapolitefsi. Clientelism, corruption, bad governance, the culture of lawlessness and violence in the universities, etc. So the past was used as a lens through which to read the present and all ills. And again, we could talk about this, the idea of the populism of PASOK from in the 1980s and so on, made some commentators ask to get rid of the metapolitefsi, να τελειώνουμε με τη μεταπολίτευση. Now, while some vehemently rejected the transitional arrangements, however, others strongly defended them. I would roughly say that there were three groups at the time. The deniers, blaming the metapolitefsi for all ills in Greek society. A second group of claimers who would feel linked to the transitional past and would defend metapolitefsi and its achievements. And maybe a smaller middle category, the agnostics, namely people who might still feel bound to the period, but who would not actively reflect on it, condemn it, or defend it on those years. Here, we should add this powerful social movement called the Indignados. The movement that started in Spain, in Madrid in May 2011. I remind you that Greece was grouped together with Spain and Portugal as the pigs, debated the fallacies of Spanish democracy. Actually, their slogan in Spain was, they call it democracy, but it is not. Right? Le llaman democracia, pero no lo es. An interesting aspect of the Indignados is that they also involved some way of rethinking about the past, and this is their equivalent in Athens, the Aganaktismeni in Greece, who I think joined in the attacks on the metapolitefsi, but from a different perspective. Their challenge of a major given of the collective and public memory was the ideal character of the democratic transition, and their one of the most famous slogans insisted on a continued presence of authoritarian legacies. So on the one hand, we have this, this idea, we can see here George Papandreou, Prime Minister at the time, being linked to Georgios Papadopoulos, the exact same thing that we see in the Spanish Indignados, Prime Minister of the time, Rajoy, embracing the dead Franco with a passionate kiss. But so we have the idea of the fallacy, democratic fallacy. But I think this is the most interesting slogan of the entire movement in Greece: bread, education, freedom. The junta did not end in 1973. Appropriating the Polytechnic's most famous catchphrase: bread, education, freedom. Getting the dates wrong, obviously, but beyond, in Greek it rhymes, as you see, Ψωμί, παιδεία, ελευθερία, η Χούντα δεν τελείωσε το 1973. But beyond the necessity of rhyming, the wrong date reverberated this deeply imprinted conviction among the demonstrators, namely that it was the students of the Polytechnic, and I would say not only the demonstrators, it's a deeply imprinted conviction in Greek collective memory that it was the students of the Polytechnic who actually brought down the colonels. The slogan reflected the need to revisit the very beginning of democracy, going back from 74 to 73. Democracy should have been, as the slogan implies, the result of the Polytechnic, of the popular uprising, and not of the shady deal between the military and politicians 8 or 9 months later. Last but not least, the slogan indicates that there are authoritarian residues supposedly linger on in branches of the Greek state, well, especially the police. Now, the slogan, "The junta did not end in 73, became mainstream. It was replicated on numerous occasions. Of course, it's a strategic political act. It's a framing to mobilize emotional resources. But I would say the interesting thing about it is that it renders the Great Recession, that moment, polytemporal. The past seemed to be flattened into the present, claiming the conditions of possibility and the political momentum and aspiration of the transition years. A momentum and aspirations that at that time looked very, very far. This was a direct challenge to, again, the standard narrative regarding the transition as finished business. I would say that this poster by the youth of the up-and-coming Syriza party at the time, this is from 2014, on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the Polytechnic, or shortly after actually, declared that we did not experience the junta or a democracy. Junta δεν γνωρίσαμε, ούτε δημοκρατία. You can see, again, the idea and the similarity with the Spanish indignados in the claim that the current state of affairs, or the post-authoritarian state of affairs, was in far from being ideally democratic. Now, needless to say that much of this analogical thinking between the junta and the recession triggered violent reactions, especially from people who had lived the dictatorship period. I just use one example here. I have several, but this is a quote from Petros Martinidis, an architecture professor and public intellectual at the time, who expresses horror at all this analogical thinking. I quote, "This is the revival of the anti-dictatorship struggle. The children of people my age who have either gone through a soft version of the anti-dictatorship struggle, like myself, or a much rougher one, and who have listened to their parents tell them stories about the past, about the dictatorship, wanted to mimic them. And that is the horror. It is for the same reason that people in the Philippines need representations of the flagellations and the crucifixion every Easter." End of quote. So Martinidis interprets that desire in young people in 2011 as akin to the ritualistic self-flagellation sometimes seen in moments of Catholic zeal, intentionally rejecting the age-old tradition of invocation and repetition as a ritual way to maintain a record of the past. Now, these complex intergenerational dynamics about the metapolitevsi and its memory are masterfully represented in Elias Maglini's controversial novella, The Interrogation. The story is about a father who had been tortured during the junta as a young left-winger, and his 20-year-old artist daughter who defies her father's version of the fact and his authority over the events at present. What Maglinis aptly demonstrates, however, is that even though subsequent generations might not remember the events directly, they still look at them as a defining factor for understanding society, politics, the crises, or the Great Recession, and themselves. This signified a dialogue between a moment of political exaltation, where everything seemed possible, the transitions, and a moment of political despair, where all seemed lost, the moment of the recession. No one expressed this generational clash better than Juan Carlos Monedero in Spain, founding member of the Podemos party, who in 2011, the same year, published a book with the telling title, The Transition Recounted to Our Parents. Now, Back in Greece, promises of a new metapolitefsi, to go back to where we started from, on both right and left, proliferated in the following years, an invocation that made an appeal for a radical reboot that never really took place. Apart from Alexis Tsipras' invocation of the term new metapolitefsi, right-wing politician and prime minister between 2012 and 2015, Antonis Samaras, also asked for a new metapolitefsi. Actually, Samaras claimed that his slogan was plagiarized by the left, but in reality, Samaras spoke of the new metapolitefsi a couple of years later than Tsipras. But it is interesting, this invocation of the new metapolitefsi. Others spoke of the final end of the old metapolitefsi and the beginning of the new metapolitefsi as starting with the referendum of July 2015. Metapolitefsi, a phenomenon that began with a referendum on the monarchy, December 1974, ended with a referendum on austerity politics 40 years later. And here, γράφουμε ιστορία. Now, let me just add here that a couple of years before the referendum, and here I'm not trying to connect the two, a different group of people was also debating in its own way the end of the metapolitefsi. This is the burial in 2013 of Colonel Dertilis, a military officer, a junta hardliner, who killed a protester during the Polytechnic in November 1973. His funeral was massively attended by members of Golden Dawn, including some of its MPs at the time. And if Golden Dawn is at present dispersed, this picture gives us pointers about how the far right, in general, remembers democratization. In Greece, as in much of the rest of Europe, challenging and reinterpreting the democratic past is not an exclusive vocation of leftist movements. 10 years later, this is becoming, alas, the norm almost everywhere in Europe. Now, I started this lecture by posing a question: how does the history and memory of the Greek transition matter today? The massive interest and the passionate debates that the gradual re-examination of post-authoritarian structures and processes triggered in the social, the political, the artistic realm testify to the fact that the Greek metapolitefsi still generates emotional responses. The past is returning with a vengeance, and memory is a key concern, a fact that comes in stark contrast to the privileging on the future, so characteristic of 20th century modernity. But is this transitional past, the metapolitefsi past, a burden and a trap, or is it an anchor and a springboard? Two new tendencies of the past few years regarding metapolitefsi gives us pointers to this, including this year that we are celebrating the 50 years since 1974. One is the tendency to consider the PASOK period as responsible for all ills. It seems that this tendency is being reversing as of late. A recent survey done by the newspaper, the center-right newspaper Kathimerini, in this survey, Andreas Papandreou scored the same or slightly better than Konstantinos Karamanlis as the most successful prime minister of the metapolitefsi. And indeed, there is a nostalgia for the early PASOK years, even among people too young to remember them, and a lot of memes and jokes about it, of course. But most importantly, at a recent conference organized by Kathimerini and the LSE on the 50 years since democratization, it was clear that there has been a reversal of the blanket rejection of the metapolitefsi by certain political elites, and a tendency to rather look at it now as a success story. Bypassing Andreas Papandreou in particular and salvaging the Karamanlis years, coupling them with Kostas Simitis modernization, and arriving to the present government by Kyriakos Mitsotakis. So these are the people who try to reinterpret the metapolitefsi as a success story today, though often they are the same ones who demonized it only a few years earlier. The second pointer is the blatant rejection of the Polytechnic as a major element in the democratization of the country, and a reinterpretation of the Polytechnic as a perilous occurrence of the past. Recent revisionist attempts by conservative journalists and scholars alike aim to present a direct causal connection between the Polytechnic and the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. These voices argue counterfactually that without the uprising, Ioannidis would not have overthrown Papadopoulos and by extension would not have toppled Makarios, leaving Turkey no opportunity to invade. The Polytechnic not only did not topple the junta, but it gave way to a much fiercer regime that led in a linear way to the Cyprus tragedy, this idea tells us. Now, this is a major element in terms of how public remembrance and collective memory operate nowadays, rejecting a major legitimizing element for the democratization of the country, the metapolitefsi from below that the Polytechnic signified. Reversely, public history is characterized nowadays by a rather bittersweet depiction of the late junta years as nostalgic and innocent, as this series, Our Best Years, Τα καλύτερα μας χρόνια, a very popular TV show, put it. Now today, as we finally stumble from crisis to crisis, we are still searching for an alternative order that could replace the metapolitefsi precisely by debating its legacy. There is a need for new narratives, new identities, and some scapegoats. Several actors look back to the formative period of the metapolitefsi to find false consolation in supposedly unfinished business. Both right and left construct a memory of the transition that went astray, awry, too far, or not far enough. It's a failure or a success story. These legacies act as powerful symbols for social mobilization today across various generations. And I believe the intergenerational aspect emerges and becomes prominent, determining to a great extent the clashes and the disputes of the present and probably the near future. Now, in Italian historian Senso Traverso's pessimistic reading, at the beginning of the 21st century, there is no visible horizon of expectation, leaving a present charged with memory but unable to project itself into the future. Slogans such as "the junta did not end in 73" show that we live in an era which is as much a crisis of Western democracy as a crisis of memory. And in this respect, Greece is exemplary of a much wider phenomenon since, with all its particularities, and I would say that it may be paradigmatic of similar memory battles in societies across Europe. Final words. Let me close with yet another funeral, but this time a funeral that was not given. That of the metapolitefsi itself. This vase reminds us of Elpinor, Ulysses' comrade, who died in Circe's palace but was never offered a proper burial. Elpinor insisted to be buried even though he was already dead and in the Hades, in the underworld. This might be a metaphor for the revival of the memories of the 70s, the metapolitefsi, and beyond. A transition we thought we had put behind, but which refuses to be laid to rest. Thank you very much.
Very much for your talk. I think you realize why Kostis Kornetis has always been extremely sharp and innovative, including this last classical metaphor for concluding his speech. Kostis was known to our audience, let's say, through the recent History Committee of the HHF podcast series, to which he contributed, that Sandra Jonas leads, to which he contributed to several episodes. But I think it's clear that there is a lot to be said about how this important period of Greek history has been interpreted recently. And I would like to now open to some questions to you. I think there's going to be several of them. I have a few, but I would keep them for the end. Phil, my good colleague Phil Veraflopoulos, is going to be moderating the online questions. Thank you all for online who are attending. But let's start with the audience here. who wants to start? Just raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you so that people online can listen to what you're saying. Yes, gentleman over there.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering, you mentioned, you had passing mention of Samuel Huntington earlier in your talk, and I'm just wondering if you go back to 74, 75, the revolution or the democratic upheavals that took place in Portugal, Spain, and Greece were obviously positive developments ultimately for the most part, but I think at the time, at least my memory of it, being relatively young at the time, was, at least in the coverage in the West, was that the West was very preoccupied, or at least the elites in the West were very preoccupied with a sense of decline in the West, with the battle of communism against Euro-communism, the almost imminent fall of Vietnam in 1975. So it seems to me that in comparison to the better known sort of democratic revolutions in 1989, that the democratic upheavals that you mentioned were kind of either overlooked by and large in the West, or, I mean, Huntington himself authored the Trilateral Commission's sort of critique about democracies. There was an excessive democracies, or that they could be problematic if they went too far, or we sort of had to rein them in. I think he co-authored that with Michel Cruiser in the 75. So I'm just wondering if you sort of broaden out your critique, how do you think those upheavals were looked upon at the time, and have they changed in perspective? Because to a large extent, it seems to me in the larger geopolitical picture, they were kind of overlooked at the time.
In the West, you mean?
In the West, yeah.
Right. Should I?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, thank you. This is a very important question, you're right about Huntington and his wavering about several things. Of course, being a political scientist, he belonged to this group of people that today we call transitologists, right? Philip Schmitter, Guillermo O'Donnell, people who try to really provide a kind of a blueprint of what a smooth democratization or smooth transition is. So kind of ticking some boxes, right? What you really need to have there, like the army going back to the barracks and the elections and so on and so forth. But I remind you that the book, The Third Wave of Democratization, starts with the Portuguese Revolution, which is the most radical of the three. I would say that we have three very different transitions, despite I stressed that there are commonalities in terms of grassroots action or memory, but they're very different. We have a clear rupture, radical rupture, which is Portugal. We have a pacted transition, as it's called, which is Spain, with the regime itself somehow administering its transformation. And we have a middle ground, which is Greece, with a kind of regime collapse there. And I think it's precisely the uniqueness of each of these transitional arrangements that also triggered the reactions at the time. You know, we might say that they also, people like Fishman and others, they talk about a path dependency, that they kind of conditioned how the democracies evolved over the following decades in each single case. But I think there was a lot of apprehension, especially about Portugal, and where is that going, right? In like a real revolution. Well, but a bloodless one. Well, of course, there was a lot of blood in the Portuguese colonies until that time, and there was less apprehension, I think, about Greece, and then Spain, because of the Portuguese and the Greek precedents, it was seen as, okay, now it's about time that Spain follows suit. So in a way, there was not much apprehension about that. Even though it is true that the so-called popular factor, what was going on in the streets, the radical demands in terms of grassroots actions and actors, they triggered several comments and articles and so on. I wouldn't go that far, though, as to say that they were overlooked. I wouldn't go that far. I think that there was a lot of coverage. There was a lot of interest in what was going on there, and interestingly, there was a lot of interest also in between these countries. Like looking at each other, which was not really so much the case until that point. So, like grouping these countries together as the new democracies of Southern Europe, as they were called, and then Pouladzas and others also, they used this idea, was rather new. It wasn't the case until then.
Yes.
Hello. So thank you very much for coming here today. We're at a great university, so my question pertains to education. So how are current Greek university students taught the metapolitefsi? What is the prevalent framing, and how do students and youth in general tend to interpret this turbulent period of history?
In schools, in the universities?
Yes.
That's a good question.
It is a good question.
Even though I have to say that being like teaching abroad, I'm not ideally placed to talk about this. But my feeling is that the people who teach the metapolitefsi, they teach it more in terms of what was going on in high politics, the kind of success story from above, Karamanlis as the statesman, and then leading up to the accession to the European Economic Community and so on. I think there has been a tendency to talk more and more about the metapolitefsi from below, the grassroots movements and so on, but I'm not really sure that this is being taught right now. I think it takes some time for these developments, historiographic developments, to reflect on teaching. But this is it's very impressionistic, what I'm saying.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much for this great presentation. So, your interpretation was that metapolitefsi is dead, but we have not buried it yet, right? Am I correct? So, you presented that some have argued that metapolitefsi ended in July 2015. Where would you pinpoint the end of metapolitefsi? And if 2015, why not the general elections? And then, if we're talking about elections, do we make metapolitefsi just a political event? Then another question is about the new period that's coming. Is it an extension of metapolitefsi? New metapolitefsi, for example, is an extension of the old metapolitefsi, or is it a new period? I have heard, for example, the word also neopolitefsi, the term neopolitefsi. How would you comment on that?
Thank you, Alexander. Is that who coined that term? Is that your term, neopolitefsi?
I have heard it going around. So
Okay.
it's not a scholarly term.
Interesting. I'm asking because I haven't seen it, so I mean it's interesting. It's a very good question. I'm wavering. I think I would also tend to think that it's the 1980s and I agree with Fishman's idea of the coda. So I would go for 1989 as the end of that era. I believe the whole idea of the metapolitefsi being dead is that I don't think that we can use that term to talk for both the initial transition to democracy, like the technical transition, and the 50 years that have transpassed since then. It's very confusing, and we are Greeks, the only ones who are using this term. So no one else that in terms of transitions, and especially in the European South. The Spaniards say transition. The Portuguese used to say revolução, which is the revolution, but nowadays they talk more and more about transition as well, in order to decrease also confusion about it. So that's my quick answer. There is a group of people, like the late Elias Nikolakopoulos, who have been arguing for the use of the term Third Greek Republic. So a clear differentiation between metapolitevsi being really what happens on the 24th of July 1974, or at the maximum the elections of the 17th of November, and that's that. And then from that point onwards, from the first democratic elections, it's the Third Greek Republic. And that's also an interesting idea. Now, why the referendum of 2015 and not the elections? Because of the idea of the referendum, right? It's like side-ended, right? It's book-ended by two referenda, one in 75 and one in 2015. It kind of made sense to some people, but neopolitevsi, I take note of that. It's an interesting term. Thank you.
Yes, here. And then we'll take a couple of questions from online.
Hi. You mentioned the Polytechnio being the start of the metapolitevsi. I'm really curious about the mood in Greece and daily life among Greeks from the time of the student uprising and the subsequent deaths and July 1974. Was there a sense that the junta was doomed? Did they feel lame duck? Like, I'm just wondering what the feeling was amongst the population and how government was referred to in those days.
Right after the...
Yeah, right after the student uprising.
It's a tough one. So I think the Polytechnio is the apogee of what was considered to be the controlled, or let's say, the opening up of a space within Greek society thanks to the controlled liberalization, partly thanks to the controlled liberalization. So there is a feeling there that the regime is weak, right? The fact that the regime does not intervene for 3 days kind of reinforced that feeling. But then again, it's an occupation that is crushed violently after that. And you have the reintroduction of martial law very soon afterwards, right? Like a week afterwards, Ioannidis takes over. So I think that the feeling at the time was a feeling of helplessness. It wasn't a feeling of euphoria about the great resistance at all. It was because nobody knew, where to go after that, because the years that had created, that of accumulation until we reached that point of explosion, they seem to evaporate after what had happened. And the months after the Polytechnio, they're terrible, and especially for the student movement, it's organization after organization that get massively arrested. The DFE and Rigas Fereos and ASPE. Anyway, so, and nobody knows how long this is going to last. So one thing that I'm always arguing against at present is this kind of presentism, because we know nowadays that the Ioannidis regime only lasted for another 8 months and, a bit more. Very often you get people saying, yeah, but people kind of felt that this was coming to an end. I'm not really sure about this. I'm not really sure. I guess with the benefit of hindsight, it seems clear that this was a regime that, with all the hardliners in place, kind of going back to 1967 or even to harder stances than that. And then, with the whole Cyprus folly and everything, that couldn't last. But I think, again, this is with the benefit of hindsight. And again, look at what was going on abroad. Look at Melina Mercouri and Gilles Dassen. They made a very interesting movie called The Rehearsal, where they it's a reenactment of the Polytechnio uprising. It's a very Brechtian, right? It's very self-reflexive, and you can see them. You can see Dassen directing and saying, "Melina, Mikis, come here, do this, do that." It's a very emotional. So this film was made right before the collapse of the Ioannidis regime. It never made it actually to the theaters abroad, because they were in New York at the time, because the regime collapsed. But the fact that they made that movie at that time, and if you see what they say and so on, is that they really try to, I don't know, raise awareness about the Greek regime. They really feel this is going to last who knows how long. So, yeah.
Phil, any questions from the online audience?
We do. So, question one. Can the nostalgia for the Huda in Greece today be compared to the nostalgia that we see in Russia for communism and Stalin, and the nostalgia for fascism or East German communism in different parts of Germany, and similar feelings of for communism and fascism and authoritarianism generally in other parts of the world, among people who have been left behind, who are feeling the effects of a global transition? That's one. The other is, what hopes do you have that a sober, non-ideological examination of the Metapolitevsi period, like the one we're seeing here tonight, I take that as a compliment to you, can take place in Greece itself? Is that asking for the impossible to take place? And then a couple of pointed comments. Many terms being used, but most Greeks can't afford food or medicine, LOL. Isn't the Huda still ruling Greece? Didn't they just change from army fatigues to expensive politicians' suits? So that's what you have online. I would...
I didn't get that one, sorry.
Neither did I.
Okay.
So I wasn't going to... I think the point, it actually came up in your presentation. I do get it. The point that some make that nothing really changed. We've gone from one set of oppressors in army fatigues to a different set of civilian oppressors with the same authoritarian mindset. I have two small questions. One, for those who are new to the topic, it would be useful to have an English language translation of Metapolitevsi, because we've danced around it. Is it transition? Is it regime change? What is it exactly? How would you define it in dictionary terms? And secondly, are we still arguing about what it means? Because another perennial debate about the Civil War is dead and buried. I mean, is that a fair assessment? Or do we have two unending debates with unburied dead happening simultaneously?
You mean the Greek Civil War?
Correct.
Right. Thank you. God, this is. I mean, the nostalgia question is a difficult one. I really cannot answer that. I think these are very, very different phenomena. These are very different settings. To talk about regimes that lasted for, I don't know, 40 years and more, and this regime that lasted for 7 years. I understand that there is a retro element, and that kind of, it can be attractive to a certain groups of people about these authoritarian paths of one way or another, but I'm not sure we can really compare them, like totalitarianism to authoritarianism, and in very different moments of time. So that's my very kind of brief and inconclusive reflection on on this. Can there be a sober analysis in Greece of the metapolitefsi? Of course, I refer to several Greek scholars, and you know, some of them they teach in and write in Greece, and they can be very, I think, sober and think about this moment. Again, this is an important moment that in which we talk now. My feeling is that 50 years is always an important, it's always a turning point, it's always a landmark moment when it comes to a historiographic analysis, reflection about the past. It happened with the Civil War that you mentioned. So 1999, which was the 50 years since the end of the Greek Civil War in 1949, is the official, in a way, starting point of the big debates about the Civil War. It started off with a big conference in Athens, and then more and more, and then the so-called new wave arrived and followed. So it remains to be seen what's going to come up from now on in the following years. You know, I think this is absolutely crucial. Did nothing change? I really don't believe this. I think there were really landslide changes after 1974. Suffice to say that this is despite the crisis, despite everything, the smoothest time in Greek parliamentary history. We had all these elections since 1974, with different parties coming to power, elections which were not once contested for not being clean elections, right? Being rigged or whatever. So I think this is huge. So I don't believe in this, what is called gatopardismo, right? Like this idea of, you kind of change things so that things remain the same. I don't think this is the case. I don't share this kind of cynicism. I think there were really important changes there. But having said that, it is an important task and exercise to look at some continuities, some survival. There are always survivals, no matter what. And that goes to a previous question about, is it everything political? Not everything is political. There are cultural issues there which are important continuities. Think about the fact that Greece had two television channels, ERT and IENEV. IENEV was the armed forces channel throughout the early metapolitefsi years, and up to 1980, 81. PASOK comes to power to change that. It's insane if you think about it. But this is what happens. So does that mean that nothing changed? No, but it means that there are some interesting residues there in all cases, even in Portugal where there is a revolution. So you can really not have an absolutely clean state, and that goes to some critics of the transitional justice, for example. Why didn't the civil servants, for example, get tried and things like that? But again, it's an interesting debate. Finally, Civil War and the dead of the Civil War, they're connected. They're absolutely connected. I think an important thing that I didn't say, or I didn't stress enough, is that 1974 is the end of the long post-Civil War period. It is Alexandros Kodzias, the novelist. He used to call it ο τριακονταετής πόλεμος, right? The Greek 30-year war. And it really lasts from the 40s up to the 70s, despite the sickly democracy in between and so on, and the center governments and they're trying to reform, but they can't, and so on and so forth. This all really reaches an end point in 1974. So, are there do we have skeletons in the closet from the Civil War period? We were discussing with Sakis, for example. There's an issue about Mass graves from the Civil War. There was mass grave in Florina. That was a big taboo that we don't want to talk about, which is an interesting thing. There is a political scientist called Iosif Kovras who works on a comparative way on mass graves in Greece, Cyprus, and Spain. And there again you can see the interesting parallels in terms of silences, for example. I live in Spain, and I think the silences there are just incredible, deafening about the Civil War and the mass graves. So I believe that Greece, despite the silences, despite the taboos, again, the Civil War is an opened up thing. We talk about it, we dissected it. I don't think it's not. It's an unburied El Pinor, to be honest.
Yes, we have a question at the back. Over there.
I keep looking at your title, The Greek Transition to Democracy. If we think of it as a project that never finishes, in your reflection, what are some of the conditions that, I guess in the last 50 years, stopped it from becoming a stronger democracy than it could have been? And I don't know if you can philosophize about what you would want to see in the future for the country. I mean, I was thinking a lot about, we had a very good conversation about the Polytechnic and at York University, and thinking a lot about why do we still to this moment disagree? Can we argue about what happened on that day or not, and what could have prevented the country? Just what you were touching on, the silences. I think that's one aspect of it, but maybe there's other aspects about the education of our youth, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know. I'm sure there are many conditions that would help us have a stronger democracy.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think to go back to Robert Fishman, who is a really important analyst of transitions. I mean, especially Spain and Portugal, but he's interested in Greece as well. So he always includes some comments on Greece. In his view, the very important variable there has to do with how responsive the post-authoritarian governments are to popular demands. And then again, I agree with that. There is that triplet. That you have Portugal with a very responsive government to pressure from below. You have Spain on the other end being very unresponsive to popular pressure. And again, you have Greece somewhere in the middle. So I would say that probably it could be, especially in the early years of the Metapolitefsi, more responsive to these wide variety of grassroots movements. There is an explosion in industrial action, and the first years are really, really impressive in terms of what was going on in the streets, and not always a response from the government. So that's one thing that I have in mind. Again, we go back to the territory that I already touched on, which is transitional justice, and some people say that, well, there many people who were involved directly in the junta mechanism, in the junta governments, and so on. The so-called civilian, whatever, of the junta governments, they were never tried. They never received any sentences and so on, and that's a setback. But then again, that's why I mentioned Spain, because you have that case where a regime that was a very bloody regime, especially in its early stages, which was Franco, received a blanket amnesty, so no one was ever tried. So I think we have to have a kind of perspective there of what was going on in other. I guess comparative studies in this respect helps us get a better perspective in terms of this. I wanted to say something more, but I think I'm going to remember
Let's take two more questions. Michalis?
Oh, I have it in mind now.
Okay.
I think there is an important thing that we tend to. There is a very binary way of looking at the metapolitevsi as the metapolitevsi from above, Karamanlis and so on, and the metapolitevsi from below, the movements. And my feeling is that even though there are some virtues into this reading, it also oversees interesting moments of confluence and. So one. I was reading fairly recently these autobiographical writings by Mikis Theodorakis, and Mikis Theodorakis was, of course, very famous up from, despite everything else, for this coining that slogan, which is the metapolitevsi slogan, the early metapolitevsi slogan, is Karamanlis or tanks, right? Right before the first elections. It's not, here we're not choosing between different parties. Here it's either you get Karamanlis or you get back to the militaries. But the interesting thing Theodorakis says, and this he writes at the time, this is, I think in early 1975 he talks about it, he talks about Karamanlis bringing Greece out of the military arm of NATO, which was like a major move in protest of the Turkish invasion in Cyprus, and of course, you have two countries being NATO members there on the brink of a conflict. And Theodorakis says something very interesting. He says, who were the first ones who talked about the perils of NATO? Who were the first ones who talked about, the Atlanticist issues and so on? We, us, the left. And now, finally, you have the right adopting our slogans and our policies. It's a very interesting reading of somehow an indirect impact of leftist demands on a conservative government or conservative politician. I just wanted to add this.
Thanks. Yep.
Thank you, Kostis, for a great talk. And going back to the context of the end of the metapolitevsi, Third Republic, whichever way you want to call it, but we have a narrative that is kind of percolating through political institutions and a political kind of science and events. But when we go to a narrative that looks at the social element of the Third Republic, metapolitevsi, whatever we're going to call it, there, do we have a clearer picture of when it ends, whether it has ended? Is it part of maybe the collective memory of metapolitevsi or of Polytechnio, which I think, truth be told, is slightly waning if we look at the newer generations of people in Greece? So I just wanted to kind of hear your kind of thoughts around the social aspect of the Third Republic and whether we have an end to what we call the metapolitevsi on that level.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a very difficult one. I think definitely the feeling, an important aspect that I didn't talk about, that I didn't touch on, has to do with redistribution of resources, and this is really important, an important element of the metapolitevsi, especially, of course, in the what goes on in the 1980s. And there is this feeling, this idea of a social contract there that's being sealed and signed, that ceases to exist with a Great Recession. I think there is this widespread feeling, and it's much more than a feeling, of course. I think it's pretty tangible of this collapsing, and especially for younger generations. So it's definitely a rupture there, and therefore I do understand why some people think that actually Kostas Kostis, an important historian, an economic historian, he believes that this is the end of the metapolitevsi, right in 2008, 2009, and he adds, but this is a global phenomenon. And that's why, we keep talking about Portugal and Spain, and they have the similar experiences after 8 and 9, even though not half as dramatic as the one in Greece. But then Kostis says, no, it's much more international than that. It's global. It's the, what goes on there. In a way, the whole idea about globalization that starts in the 1970s, right? The whole collapse of Bretton Woods and the shock of the global and all that. That first crisis, economic crisis, the oil crisis and so on. The idea is, again, it's being bookended by 2008 and 9. And the social contracts across the board collapsed, not just in the European South. So, but I can see the merits to that.
I think, yes, hold on, sorry, Panagiotis. I think this is a very important point because precisely it points to the sort of more global aspects of the collapse of the dictatorship itself. Because what is it if not a moment of extreme crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean? That's where it starts. And I want to ask you about this, whether this year of commemoration of the event of 74 is also, of course, as you alluded to, a year of commiseration of the Cyprus disaster, of the invasion and occupation of Cyprus. Has it always been like this for the Greek Republic? Has it always been this sort of awkward moment of bittersweet, let's say, remembering the July 74 events? Or has it been sort of a more recent event that this is how we approach it? Has it always been for the Greek Republic as an institution, as a state, this mixed emotions, this awkward moment, or has it been differently? What is your sense?
Yeah, I think it has been like that from the very beginning. Like if you go back to the press of the time, like 24th of July 75, 24th of July 76, you can see that it is. I mean, of course, at the time the feeling was that we're still consolidating here, so not much celebration, but. Polytechnic was already being celebrated from the very beginning there. So I think this broad affair between these two dates, it starts from the very beginning. But yeah, I think it was awkward from very early on. There was a period, I would say, with Simitis especially, and Stephanopoulos, where that picture came from, in which. First and second term in office by Simitis, this presidential gala became a little bit more, I would say, fancy. And it's precisely the fancy presidential gala of the 24th of July that was attacked during the crisis. And Carlos Papoulias, who was the president of the Republic at the time, he decided, because I don't know if I have to remind you of all kinds of parades, the 28th of October, the 25th of March, politicians were being booed, and Papoulias himself as the president of the Republic as well. And he said, okay, that's it. We're not going to have any more of these public ceremonies, including the gala. For several years during the crisis, there was no gala in the presidential.
That's interesting.
But again, I think from the very beginning it was like this bittersweet thing. We celebrate democracy, but again it's a Cypriot tragedy, and it was much more intense in the first years. It was an open thing. It was an open wound. It was a if today we talk about the lingering trauma, which I don't think it is anymore what it used to be, like new generations, I don't think they care that much about that moment. To be totally honest, at that time, no, it had an impact on the entire Greek society. It was very traumatic. So how can you celebrate your Cypriot brethren's moment of tragedy, right? It's very awkward, but. I can see that with the anniversary now. I was discussing with some Portuguese colleagues what happened the day before yesterday, 5 days ago, was the 25th of April, 50th anniversary of the Portuguese Revolution. it was immense what happened. It was like an immense demonstration of people, innumerable events, academic, artistic. I don't see the same happening in Greece right now. I saw a couple of things, especially Kathimerini, very few things. Eteron did some things, this kind of think tank. But I don't know, like scattered. It's not the same. Yeah.
Very low profile.
Yeah.
Yes, Panagiotis. Any more from online?
Thank you. So you compare and contrast Greece, Portugal, Spain the whole time. But during this same period, we have Pinochet in Chile, Videla in Argentina, and simultaneously we see all of Latin America making this transition from democracy to dictatorship. How would you comment on that, and simultaneously looking at the role of foreign powers, especially the United States, that plays a role in a lot of these dictatorships, especially when in Europe we see them allowing, or rather turning a blind eye to the rise of social democratic and democratic socialist leaders in, as you pointed out, Spain, Portugal, and Greece? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great one. So Videla comes a little bit later, right? Because it's 76, but it doesn't matter because you're right that Greece, in terms of the periodization of its coup d'etat and its dictatorship, it falls within, it's closer to a Latin American periodization and context rather than, the other Southern European dictatorships, they date back to the 1920s and 30s. So it's a very different moment of time. There are no coup d'etats in Europe in 1967. So Greece is a bit of an anomaly there. It really belongs to a different kind of late Cold War d'etat moment. So you're right. There are some actors. Kissinger, for example, is a major actor who operates both as a politician who affects, especially what's going on in 1974, his thoughts about and decisions about Cyprus, at the exact same time, a year after, the coup d'etat in Chile. So this famous Kissinger cynicism and so on. We can see it in both cases. But there are more connections there. So, for example, what's going on in terms of torture in Greece? We have very similar practices happening in Latin America. You have the CIA playing an important role in both contexts, much more than the State Department, I would say. Alex Papachelas has a very interesting book. It's a sequel of his first book, The Rape of Greek Democracy. The new one is called Inside a Dark Room, and it's about that really dark period of the Greek dictatorship, which is mainly the Ioannidis. This is a book mainly about the Ioannidis. Yeah. He talks a lot about the first years, but the really important contribution is what happens in 74. And you can see there that the CIA is really kind of, like loose, you have like loose cannons, like agents who are like, I don't know, they do whatever they want around the US Embassy and so on. We have very similar things happening in Latin America. So again, I think geopolitically, in a way, Greece belongs at that point to this kind of what we call today the global South. It's closer to that. But there is a reaction to that also connects the two contexts. And very briefly, I would Sakis said that we are kind of publishing now a volume on the Greek case in the Council of Europe, 1969, Strasbourg. Council of Europe basically expelling Greece from its ranks. And Amnesty International, which was a very young organization at the time, started basically, it really became big with Greece. And then with Chile and Argentina and so on and so forth. So again, there are interesting contours there. Last thing, the trials. The trials of the ringleaders, again, they are defended by some people like Nikos Alivizatos, like jurists, as a forgotten achievement and masterpiece. Others, as I said before, they say that they were very limited and so on. It's a very powerful precedent to what became the trials of the Argentine junta in 1985. And it's very impressive that the Argentinian jurists, they knew about the Greek precedent. And it sets a this didn't happen before. So you have Nuremberg, which is an international court, and then you have Greece, 1975. It's very, I think we have to go back to that moment. And we have to go back to that moment as generating, again, important responses in post-authoritarian context beyond Greece.
I think it's a very important point as well to conclude our talk. I want to thank, first of all, Kostis for this, wonderful topical and also innovative in many ways and suggestive of what's the importance of this moment in Greek history for the last 50 years. I must say, I met Kostis on the night of on the evening of his dissertation defense in Florence many, many years ago. And he's always been, as cheerful and also sharp as that night. I want to thank all of you, first of all, for coming as well, and Hellenic Heritage Foundation for everything that we do together with the University of Toronto here program, and the Hellenic Canadian Academic Association of Ontario that I'm very proud to represent together with Phil Trendafilopoulos and our colleagues. Thank you all very much, and especially thank you, Kostis.